rhythmic clang of hammers, striking steel spikes, echoed across the Utah desert like a mechanical heartbeat, one that would bind a nation together whether it wanted to be bound or not. It was the summer of 1865, and the Union Pacific Railroad was clawing its way westward mile by agonizing mile through some of the most unforgiving terrain God ever created. History books would later celebrate the engineers, the railroad barons, the visionaries who dreamed of an iron road connecting two oceans. But they rarely mentioned the army that truly built America, an army that wielded not rifles but rolling pins and cast iron skillets. Deep within the bowels of a converted boxcar that rattled along behind the advancing railhead, a man named Elias Crawford was fighting his own war. At 32, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from working in conditions that would break lesser men, a square jaw darkened by perpetual stubble eyes, the color of creek stones and forearms corded with muscle that came not from swinging a hammer but from wrestling hundreds of pounds of dough into submission every single day. The temperature inside his domain, what the rail workers sardonically called the hell car, hovered somewhere north of 120 degrees. 3 massive cast iron ovens fired by coal and burning 24 hours a day transformed the boxcar into a mobile inferno. Elias worked stripped to the waist, his torso glistening with sweat that mixed with the ever-present cloud of flour dust hanging in the superheated air. Every breath tasted like baker's lung waiting to happen. But Elias Crawford was the best baker west of Omaha, and he knew it. More importantly, so did the 800 men whose empty bellies depended on his skill. "Coffee's burning again," shouted Mickey O'Shea, one of the cookies, from somewhere in the chaos of the adjacent mess car. "Then stop talking about it and pull it off the damn fire," Elias called back, his hands never stopping their rhythmic work. He was elbow deep in a wooden trough, the size of a bathtub, kneading what would become the evening's bread for the entire camp. 50 pounds of flour water drawn from a questionable creek, a generous dollop of rendered lard, and the most precious ingredient of all, a cupful of starter from the sourdough keg. That keg was Elias's most prized possession. Other men treasured photographs of sweethearts back home or lucky gambling tokens. Elias treasured a wooden barrel containing a bubbling living culture of wild yeast and bacteria that he'd kept alive for 6 years. In winter he'd wrap it in blankets and sleep with it to keep it from freezing. In summer he monitored it like a nervous parent, adjusting its temperature and feeding schedule with meticulous care. If that starter died, the entire railroad operation would grind to a halt within 2 days. Men working 12-hour shifts driving steel spikes into hardpan needed more than salt pork and beans. They needed bread, dense, chewy, filling bread that would stick to their ribs and fuel the back-breaking labor of binding a continent with iron. Elias pulled his arms from the dough trough and wiped them on a flour sack that had long since given up any pretense of cleanliness. He glanced at the massive loaves, already rising on the shelving that lined one wall, calculating timing with the precision of an artillery officer. The evening shift would be coming off work in exactly 90 minutes. If the bread wasn't ready, there would be hell to pay, possibly literally. The head cook, a grizzled Civil War veteran named Silas Blackwood, poked his head through the door connecting the kitchen car to Elias's baking domain. Silas was built like a cannonball, short, round, and potentially explosive. He'd lost 3 fingers to a Confederate mini-ball at Gettysburg, but he could still crack eggs one-handed and run the kitchen operation with the efficiency of a Prussian general. "How we looking for tonight?" Silas asked, his eyes scanning the operation with professional assessment. 40 loaves for the main crew, 3 dozen biscuits for breakfast prep, and if I can find time, maybe some dried apple pie for your little side business," Elias replied with a knowing grin. Silas's little side business was the worst-kept secret on the Union Pacific line. After the company-mandated meals were served, the kitchen car transformed into what everyone called the pie car, an informal canteen where exhausted workers could buy little luxuries with their hard-earned wages. a slice of pie for 25 cents. A cup of real coffee, not the bitter burnt swill, served at meals for a dime. The occasional cinnamon roll when sugar supplies allowed for a princely 50 cents. It was technically against company regulations. Silas was supposed to use company supplies strictly for company meals. But the railroad brass looked the other way because the pie car served a function more important than any rule book. It kept the men from spending all their pay in the mobile hellscape known as Hell on Wheels. That was the nickname for the temporary town that followed the railroad, like a parasite, a shifting collection of tense wagons and rough-hewn buildings, housing saloons, gambling dens and brothels. When the railroad advanced 5 miles west, Hell on Wheels would pack up and leapfrog ahead, ready to separate laborers from their wages through vice and violence. The pie car offered something different: warmth, sweetness, and a brief respite that didn't end in a hangover or a knife fight. Men who might otherwise have brawled in a saloon would sit peacefully around Elias's ovens, nursing cups of coffee and savoring slices of pie while swapping stories from home. Elias took pride in that. He wasn't just baking bread, he was baking a tiny slice of civilization into the wilderness. "Better sift that next batch of flour twice," Silas warned, nodding toward the sacks stacked against the wall. "Weevils are getting worse in this heat." Elias sighed. The weevils were an eternal problem. The flour that arrived by wagon from the supply depot was often months old and had been jostled across hundreds of miles of rough terrain. The tiny black beetles found their way into everything. If he had time and wasn't under pressure, he'd sift the flour carefully through fine mesh screens to remove them. But tonight time was a luxury he didn't have. He'd sift quickly, catch the worst of them, and the rest would become what the men jokingly called extra protein. It was an unspoken agreement. The workers pretended not to notice the occasional dark speck in their bread, and Elias pretended he didn't bake with contaminated flour. Everyone understood that in the wilderness, perfection was the enemy of survival. As evening settled over the high desert painting, the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have made poets weep, Elias finally allowed himself a moment's rest. The loaves were in the ovens, the biscuit dough was prepped for the morning shift, and he had just enough time to brew himself a cup of the good coffee, the kind he saved for paying customers, before the dinner rush began. He stood in the doorway of his boxcar, cradling the tin cup in his calloused hands, and watched the sun sink behind the distant mountains. Somewhere out there in that vast expanse of sagebrush and stone were people who saw this railroad not as progress but as invasion. He'd heard the stories: supply wagons, ambushed survey teams vanished, and the occasional savage attack on the work crews themselves. Elias tried not to think about it too much. He had bread to bake. But the railroad had enemies, and those enemies were getting bolder. The attack came 3 nights later, just after midnight. Elias was dozing on a flour sack in the corner of his boxcar, a double-barreled shotgun across his lap, standard procedure for guarding the food stores against thieves from Hell on Wheels, when the first sound of splintering wood jolted him awake. The train lurched violently. The shriek of metal grinding against metal pierced the night as the locomotive's wheels fought for purchase on compromised rails. Elias was thrown against the wall, his shoulder slamming into the iron stove hard enough to leave a bruise. The shotgun clattered to the floor. Then came the war cries, high ululating calls that raised every hair on his body. Through the small window of his boxcar, Elias caught glimpses of chaos, illuminated by the moon-mounted warriors, faces painted for war, swarming the derailed train like wolves on wounded prey. The crack of rifles split the night. Men were shouting, cursing, dying. The door to his boxcar crashed open. Elias grabbed his shotgun and swung it toward the entrance. But instead of a warrior, he saw one of the railroad guards stumbling backward, clutching a feathered arrow protruding from his chest. The guard's eyes met Elias's for one terrible moment before he collapsed. Behind him, the night exploded with movement. Elias caught a glimpse of a warrior in buckskin and war paint before the man was cut down by rifle fire from the guards taking defensive positions between the rail cars. More warriors fell. The railroad's security force was small but well armed with Spencer repeating rifles, a technological advantage that turned the raid into a slaughter. And then through the flour-hazed air of his boxcar, barely visible in the dim light of the banked ovens, Elias saw her. She couldn't have been more than 25, her long black hair wild around her face, her deerskin dress torn and darkened with blood spreading from her shoulder. She'd somehow made it into the boxcar during the chaos, and now crouched behind a sack of flour, one hand pressed against her wound, the other gripping a knife with a blade that gleamed in the firelight. Her eyes met his dark, fierce, and filled with something that Elias recognized immediately because he saw it every day in the mess car: hunger. But not for food. This was the hunger of someone watching everything they knew being destroyed. She tensed, raising the knife. Whether she meant to attack or to take her own life rather than be captured, Elias would never know, because in that moment he made a decision that would change both their lives. Heavy boots pounded on the wooden floor outside. "Check the food cars, make sure nothing's been taken," a voice shouted Lieutenant Jameson, commander of the railroad's security force. Elias had perhaps 3 heartbeats to act. In those 3 beats, his mind raced through options with the same calculating speed he used to time his bread. She was wounded. She was trapped. If the guards found her, they'd execute her on the spot, standard procedure for captured raiders. But when Elias looked at her eyes, he didn't see a raider. He saw the same desperation he'd seen in the faces of men at his pie car counter workers, who'd gone 3 days without pay, who were one missed meal away from collapse. And on the table beside her, knocked over in the chaos, was one of his apple pies still warm from the evening's baking. Her eyes kept flickering to it. She wasn't here for violence. She was here because she was starving. The boots were getting closer. Lieutenant Jameson's voice barked more orders. Elias made his choice. In one fluid motion, he kicked over the 50-pound sack of flour he'd been planning to sift in the morning. It exploded across the woman in a white cloud, coating her dark hair and dress, her face and hands, transforming her into a ghost. She gasped, then understood, going completely still as Elias grabbed his shotgun and stumbled toward the door. "Anyone in there?" Jameson demanded, torch held high. Elias emerged from the flour-fogged boxcar, deliberately standing in the doorway to block the view inside. "Just me, Lieutenant. And a whole lot of wasted goddamn flour. One of those savages crashed through and knocked over my stores before your boys got him. Made a hell of a mess." Jameson peered past him into the hazy interior where shapes were indistinct in the settling flour dust. "You see where he went? Fell out the other door, I think." Everything happened so fast. Elias was amazed at how steady his voice sounded when his heart was hammering like a trip hammer. "You hurt, bruised, scared, but alive." Jameson nodded curtly. "Stay armed. They might try again. We'll do a full sweep at first light." He moved on to check the next car, and Elias stood in the doorway, listening to his own heartbeat and wondering what the hell he'd just done. When the sounds of the security patrol finally faded, Elias turned back into his boxcar and closed the door. The woman was exactly where he'd left her, still coated in flour like a statue carved from chalk, her knife held ready. The only movement was her chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. "They're gone," Elias said quietly, lowering his shotgun. "For now." She stared at him, eyes wide with confusion and suspicion. Then, in halting English with an accent he couldn't quite place, she spat out, "Shoot me. Before I kill you." Elias blinked. That was not what he'd expected. "I'm not going to shoot you," he replied, setting the shotgun carefully aside and raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "And you're not going to kill me because you're bleeding all over my clean flour and you can barely stand." Her jaw clenched. "You take our food. You kill the buffalo. Your iron snake brings death." I should have killed you when I had the chance. There it was, the raw hatred that came from watching your world die. Elias had seen enough hatred in his life. He'd seen it in the eyes of Confederate soldiers during the war. He'd seen it in the eyes of railroad workers cheated of their wages. He'd seen it in the mirror during the dark months after his wife succumbed to fever, leaving him alone with nothing but his sourdough starter and his grief. He understood hatred, but he also understood something more fundamental. Nobody could hate properly on an empty stomach. Without a word, Elias picked up the apple pie that had been knocked to the floor, but miraculously remained intact in its tin. He set it on the table between them, found a relatively clean knife, and cut a generous slice. The interior steamed in the cool night air, releasing the scent of cinnamon brown sugar and rendered lard. "Eat first," he said, sliding the pie toward her. "Hate me after. It's better fuel for hating if you're not hungry." She stared at the pie as if it might be poisoned, but Elias could see the exact moment when hunger overrode suspicion. She'd been starving, truly starving, long before she'd raided this train tonight. Slowly, her knife lowered. Even more slowly, she reached out and picked up the slice of pie with her free hand. She took a small, tentative bite, and Elias watched her face transform. The hardness didn't vanish, but it softened at the edges like ice beginning to thaw. She ate the entire slice without speaking, and Elias pretended not to notice when she licked her fingers clean of every trace of sugar and butter. Only when she finished did she look up at him again. "Why?" she asked simply. It was a good question, probably the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Why risk everything for a stranger who'd come here intending violence? Why throw away his job, maybe even his life, for someone whose people saw him as the enemy? Elias thought about it while he moved to his medical kit, a small wooden box every cook kept for dealing with the inevitable burns and cuts of kitchen work. He gestured to her wounded shoulder. "Can I?" After a long moment, she nodded. As he cleaned and bandaged the gunshot wound, fortunately the bullet had passed through the fleshy part of her shoulder without hitting bone, he finally answered her question. "I've been a baker for 17 years, he said, quietly, hands steady, despite the trembling in his chest. "Started as a boy in my father's shop in Pennsylvania. I've fed soldiers on both sides of the war. I've fed railroad workers, farmers, miners, drifters, rich men and poor men, good men and bad men." He tied off the bandage. "But I've never let anyone starve in front of me if I could help it. Not when I have food to give. That's not about you being." He gestured vaguely at her buckskin dress and the traditional patterns he could see beneath the flower coating. "Whatever you are, it's about me being what I am. A man who feeds people. That's all." She absorbed this in silence. Finally, she said, "My name is Winona." It sounded like a gift, reluctantly given. "Elias." "Elias." She tested the name on her tongue. "You have made my death more complicated." He couldn't help it. He laughed, a short bark of dark humor. "Lady, you have no idea how complicated you've made my life either." For 3 days, the bakery car, informally christened Elias's hellhole, became a prison of heat and secrets. To the rest of the Union Pacific crew, this rolling boxcar was just a factory for carbohydrates, churning out thousands of biscuits and loaves to fuel the muscle that drove the spikes. But for Elias, the space had shrunk to a terrifying singular point, the narrow crawl space beneath the false floorboards where he kept his high-value contraband. The hiding spot carved out between the wheel axles and the subflooring to smuggle pie car luxuries like real sugar and coffee beans was barely 4 feet long and 18 inches deep. It was dark as a tomb, and with the twin cast-iron ovens roaring 24 hours a day directly above, hot enough to slow roast a man. Inside lay Winona. Elias worked in a fugue state of exhaustion and paranoia. He had to maintain the brutal rhythm of the railroad kitchen up at 4:00 a.m. to fire the ovens, kneading 500 pounds of dough with aching shoulders, sweating through his undershirt until it clung like a second skin, and yet every movement was calculated. He positioned his heavy mixing trough to block the line of sight to the loose floorboard. He dropped accidental bags of flour to mask the sound of Winona coughing in the dust-choked air. He learned about her in fragments, whispered during the cacophony of the train's movement. When the wheels screamed against the iron rails on a curve, he would kneel pretending to tie his boot and slide a canteen of water through the crack. Why, her voice would drift up dry and brittle. "Why do you not kill me, Baker, because I need dough, not flesh?" Elias muttered back, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Stay quiet. Silas is on the prowl." Silas Blackwood, the head cook, a man who had survived Antietam not by being brave, but by being observant. Silas had eyes like a hawk and a nose that could smell a lie from 3 cars away. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the luck ran out. It happened during the lull, that blessed silent hour between the lunch cleanup and the dinner prep. The train had slowed to a crawl, navigating a treacherous wooden trestle bridge over a dry gorge. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels died down to a low, grinding moan. The sudden drop in ambient noise made the bakery car feel naked. The door slid open. Silas didn't knock. He never did. He stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. He stopped, framed by the blinding Utah sunlight, before sliding the door shut, plunging the room back into the dim, flower-hazed twilight. Elias was at the workbench, his back turned, scraping dough. He froze. "Afternoon," Silas Elias said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Bread's not proofed yet. Give it another hour." Silas didn't answer immediately. He stood in the center of the car, thumbs hooked into his suspenders, his head tilted slightly. He took a deep breath, inhaling the thick air. "Yeast," Silas murmured, analyzing the atmosphere. "Charcoal. Burnt sugar." He paused, his nostrils flaring slightly. "And sage." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Sage. The scent of the high desert. The scent of wood smoke and cured buckskin. The scent of the Shoshone. It was faint, buried under the smell of baking, but to a man who had spent years fighting across the plains, it was as loud as a gunshot. I bought some herbs off a trapper at the last water stop," Elias lied, turning around. He tried to look casual, leaning back against the workbench, unconsciously placing his heavy boot directly over the loose floorboard. "Thinking of trying a new seasoning for the stew. Is that right?" Silas's eyes narrowed. They were cold gray and utterly unamused. "Since when do you season stew with wild sage, Elias? We ain't cooking for a French restaurant. We're feeding mules, and men who eat like mules." Silas began to walk. It was a slow, deliberate pacing. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of his heel strikes echoed in the silence of the slowing train. He walked around the ovens. He ran a finger along the rim of a flour barrel. He was circling. "You've been jumpy, son," Silas said softly. "Inventory is off. Sugar is missing. Water canteens are emptying faster than they should. I've been thirsty. It's 100 degrees in here. And the floor." Silas stopped. He was looking directly at Elias's feet. "You've been standing on that one spot for 10 minutes. You guard that spot like it's the gates of heaven." "Silas, look, I've got a side business, you know that? Maybe I'm hiding some good whiskey down there. I'll cut you in." "Move," Silas commanded. His voice wasn't a request. It was the voice of a sergeant addressing a private. "Silas, don't I said move." Silas lunged with a speed that belied his age. He didn't strike Elias, he shoved him. A hard, calculated check to the shoulder that sent the baker stumbling back into the dough trough. The floorboard was exposed. Silas didn't hesitate. He jammed the toe of his boot into the gap and kicked the board up. It clattered aside. The reaction was instantaneous. From the black hole beneath the floor, there was no scream of fear. Instead, a hiss of movement. A hand shot up, brown, scarred and fast as a rattlesnake strike. A bone-handled knife slashed the air, missing Silas's groin by a fraction of an inch as he leaped back, cursing. Jesus Christ on a bicycle, Silas roared, his hand flying to the heavy Colt Navy revolver at his hip. He leveled the gun at the dark opening. Come out now, or I fill this hole with lead. No. Elias threw himself between the gun and the floor. Don't shoot, get out of the way. Elias, you're harboring a savage. That's a hanging offense. She's not a savage, she's a girl, she's injured. She just tried to gelding me. Silas cocked the hammer. The metallic click was deafening in the small space. Out of the way, she's leverage. Silas Elias screamed the words, desperate to penetrate the old soldier's combat instincts. Think, use that head of yours. She's not just a raider. Silas paused, his finger trembling on the trigger. What did you say? Look at her. Elias gestured frantically to the hole where Winona had risen to a crouch. She wasn't cowering. She stared up at them, eyes burning with hate, the knife held in a reverse grip, ready to die fighting. Look at her chest, Elias panted. The beads, the bone breastplate. That's not a warrior's kit. That's royalty. Silas kept the gun trained, but his gaze flicked to the woman. Even covered in flour dust and grime, the intricate beadwork on her buckskin tunic was undeniable. It was a masterpiece of shell and dyed porcupine quills, a sign of immense status. Who are you? Silas growled. Winona stood up slowly. Her legs shook from days of confinement, but her spine was steel. She looked Silas in the eye, something few native women dared to do with white men. I am Winona, she said. Her English was accented but startlingly clear, a result of mission schooling that Silas hadn't expected. Daughter of Chief Black Kettle, keeper of the Shoshone winter count. Silas lowered the gun an inch. The gears in his head were grinding, shifting from executioner to opportunist. Black Kettle, Silas repeated. The one burning our trestles, the one who took the survey team. The same, Winona said coldly. My father has 5 of your men. The engineer, the boy with the golden hair. They are alive. He keeps them for trade. The air in the car shifted. The heat seemed to drop a few degrees. The missing survey team was a disaster for the Union Pacific. The railroad brass had halted expansion, losing thousands of dollars a day, terrified of a full-scale Indian war they couldn't afford. The army was useless, unable to find the raiders in the canyons. You knew this. Silas turned his gaze to Elias. You knew she was the key to the survey team. I figured it out, Elias stammered. If we turn her over to the lieutenant, they'll just hang her as a horse thief. The negotiations end. The 5 hostages die. But if we hold her, if we broker the exchange, we get the tracks moving again. Silas finished the thought. He holstered his gun slowly, his eyes never leaving Winona. And the man who brings back the chief engineer's nephew. That man gets a hell of a bonus. And a commendation. Silas wiped a hand over his mouth, hiding a grim smile. The pragmatist had won. You're a damn fool, Elias, Silas grunted, kicking the floorboard back toward the hole. And you're lucky I'm a greedy old bastard. He turned to the door, checking the latch to ensure it was locked tight against the prying eyes of the guards outside. She stays down there during the day, Silas commanded, his voice low and conspiratorial. At night we bring her up. We feed her meat, not just bread. We need her healthy for the trade. If she dies, our leverage dies. Silas paused, looking back at the baker and the princess covered in flour. But hear me, Elias, the old cook said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If she puts a knife in my back, I'll put a bullet in yours. Clear. Elias nodded, exhaling a breath he felt he'd been holding for 4 days. Clear. Good. Silas sniffed the air again, grimacing at the scent of sage. Now throw some more wood on that fire. It smells like a damn campfire in here. We have biscuits to bake." The next week was a masterclass in subterfuge and stress management. They couldn't keep Winona hidden forever, but they couldn't reveal her presence until they'd laid the groundwork for a proper prisoner exchange. Silas, using his pre-war experience in logistics, began carefully spreading the word through unofficial channels. The railroad had captured someone important during the raid. Someone valuable enough to trade. Meanwhile, Elias continued to care for Winona in secret, and somewhere during those whispered conversations in the darkness, something shifted between them. She told him about her childhood learning to track deer across stone that left no prints to read the weather, in the way birds flew to find water, where white men saw only desert. She told him about her mother dead from the spotted sickness the white traders brought. She told him about watching the buffalo herds dwindle year by year, until hunting them became desperate rather than ceremonial. In return, he told her about Pennsylvania, about learning to bake beside his father, about the smell of bread in the morning that meant home and safety. He told her about the war, about the men he'd fed knowing they'd die the next day. He told her about his wife Maria, and how he'd been powerless to save her when the fever came. "You carry death around you like old smoke," Winona observed one night. "So do you," Elias replied. She nodded. "Yes. We are both ghosts already, moving through a world that doesn't want us anymore." It should have been depressing, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow, in that hot flour-dusted boxcar, two people from different worlds found something that almost resembled understanding. On the 8th day, the army finally responded to Silas's carefully planted information. A captain arrived from Fort Bridger to assess the situation and determine whether a prisoner exchange was feasible. Elias and Silas cleaned Winona up as best they could, try to make her look less like a hidden refugee and more like a proper prisoner of war. When Captain Morrison entered the boxcar and saw her sitting on a flour sack with her hands bound loosely, at Elias's insistence, his eyes widened. "That's Chief Tallbear's daughter," he said, immediately. "I've seen her before at a previous treaty discussion." She translated for her father. Silas and Elias exchanged glances. It was better than they'd hoped. "We've kept her safe, Captain," Silas said carefully. "Figured she might be worth more alive than dead." "Worth more?" Morrison's laugh was harsh. "She's worth everything. Her father has been sending messages through Shoshone scouts for weeks, trying to locate her. He thinks she's dead. If we can prove she's alive and well, he'll give us back every man he's captured and guarantee safe passage for this entire section of railroad." Winona's face remained impassive, but Elias saw the slight tremor in her hands. She'd gambled her life on her father's love, and now she was about to discover if that gamble paid off. The exchange was arranged for 3 days hence to be held at a neutral site where the railroad crossed through a broad valley, open ground where neither side could stage an ambush without being seen. Those final 3 days were the strangest of Elias's life. Winona was no longer hidden but not quite free, kept under guard in a separate car under Captain Morrison's supervision. Elias was allowed brief visits to bring her food officially to keep the valuable prisoner healthy, but Morrison seemed to understand that something more complicated was happening. "You did a brave thing," Morrison told him during one of these visits. "Stupid as hell, but brave. You saved lives on both sides." Elias wasn't sure about that. He'd just tried to feed someone who was hungry. Everything else had been circumstance and luck. On the morning of the exchange, the sky was that particular shade of blue that only exists in high desert country, so bright it almost hurt to look at. The entire railroad camp had turned out to watch, kept at a safe distance by army pickets. This was history happening, one of the first peaceful resolutions of conflict on the Union Pacific Line. The Shoshone arrived from the east, a line of warriors on horseback, with the 5 captured surveyors, walking in the middle, looking thin but alive. Chief Tallbear rode at the front, his face carved from stone, betraying no emotion. From the railroad side, Winona was led forward, escorted by Captain Morrison and 4 soldiers. She walked with her head high, every inch her father's daughter. Elias watched from beside his boxcar, technically on duty, but unable to focus on anything except the woman who'd spent 8 days hiding beneath his floor. Silas stood beside him, arms crossed, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Think it'll work?" Elias asked. 50-50, Silas replied. "These things either end in peace or they end in bullets. Not much middle ground." The 2 groups met in the center of the valley. Captain Morrison and Chief Tallbear spoke briefly through an interpreter, negotiations that took less than 5 minutes because both sides wanted the same thing: their people back alive. Then Winona was released. She walked toward her father, and for the first time since Elias had met her, the mask cracked. She ran the last few steps and embraced him fiercely. Even from a distance, Elias could see Chief Tallbear's hands shaking as he held his daughter. The 5 surveyors were released simultaneously, stumbling toward the railroad side with grateful expressions. They'd been treated well enough. It seemed thin but not starved, frightened but not tortured. It should have ended there. A clean exchange, everyone getting what they wanted. But Winona turned back. She shouldn't have. Every instinct of survival said to ride away with her father back to her people and safety. But she turned, scanning the crowd of railroad workers until her eyes found Elias standing beside his flour-dusted boxcar. They looked at each other across 50 yards of open ground. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Then slowly and deliberately, Winona placed her hand over her heart. Not a wave, not a salute, but something more fundamental. A gesture of recognition, of acknowledgement that something had passed between them that transcended the hatred of their peoples. Elias nodded once, a small movement that somehow carried the weight of everything they'd shared: the pie, the whispered conversations, the understanding that they were both ghosts trying to survive in a world that was killing them slowly. Chief Tallbear spoke sharply to his daughter. She nodded, turned her horse, and rode away without looking back. Within minutes, the Shoshone party had disappeared into the broken country to the east, swallowed by sagebrush and stone. The crowd began to disperse, workers heading back to their tasks, soldiers returning to their posts. Crisis averted, history made everyone able to go about their lives. Silas clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Well, that's that. We're goddamn heroes, apparently. The brass is thrilled. We might even get a bonus." "Yeah," Elias said distantly, still staring at the empty horizon. "That's that." He turned back to his boxcar, back to his ovens, and his sourdough starter, and the eternal task of feeding an army of workers who didn't care about politics or peace treaties. They just wanted their dinner on time. That night, as Elias kneaded dough for the next day's bread, he found himself thinking about all the things he'd never said to Winona. About worlds that could never quite touch, about kindness that bridged nothing but the moment. About 2 people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and managed to create something that felt almost like hope. The bread still needed to be made. The men still needed to be fed. The railroad still pushed inexorably west, crushing everything in its path. But for 8 days, a Shoshone chief's daughter and a Pennsylvania baker had held back history with nothing but flour pie and the simple, radical act of seeing each other as human. Elias shaped the dough into loaves, with practiced hands placing each one gently in its baking tin. Tomorrow they would rise. The day after they would feed hundreds. And somewhere out in the vast wilderness, Winona would remember the white man who'd chosen compassion over safety, and Elias would remember the woman who'd taught him that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was share a meal with your enemy. The sourdough starter bubbled quietly in its keg, alive and thriving, maintained through care and attention, and the belief that some things were worth preserving even in the middle of chaos. Elias checked the fire in his ovens, adjusted the dampers, and settled in for another night of baking. The flour dust caught the lamplight like snow falling inside the boxcar. Outside, the vast American night pressed against the fragile islands of light and warmth created by the railroad camp. And somewhere in that darkness, two peoples who could never fully understand each other would continue their collision course with history. But for one brief moment in the exchange of bread for hunger, of safety for vulnerability, they'd manage to be simply human together. That would have to be enough. Authors note the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad between 1863–1869 involved incredible human suffering on all sides. While the characters in this story are fictional, the historical details about railroad kitchen operations, the Hell on Wheels phenomenon,